The sound of wind whistling through the wheat fields was the only thing breaking the silence that afternoon in October 2008. Just outside the small town of Haviland, Kansas, a county worker mowing near a gravel road noticed something half buried under the golden grass. At first, he thought it was just another piece of old farm equipment rusting in the dirt. But when he looked closer, the glint of bone in the sunlight stopped him cold. Within hours, the quiet rural stretch was crawling with deputies, their cars flashing red and blue against the endless fields. What began as an ordinary day quickly turned into the beginning of a mystery that would haunt Haviland for decades, one that would finally come full circle almost 20 years later. The remains were confirmed to be human, and from the start, investigators knew they were looking at a possible homicide. The body was badly decomposed, but there were pieces of clothing that helped narrow down the timeline: a faded denim jacket, a pair of white sneakers with blue stripes, and a cheap silver bracelet with tiny initials engraved LB. The coroner estimated the remains had been in the ground for nearly 15 years. That placed the death sometime in the early 1990s, a time when Haviland was still the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and crimes like this were unthinkable. The initials were the first clue. Detectives began combing through old missing persons files from across Kiowa County and nearby towns. It didn't take long before one name kept surfacing: Laura Bennett, a 23-year-old waitress who had vanished in June 1991. She'd been last seen leaving a late shift at the Lone Star Diner just off Main Street. Her car was found parked a few blocks away, keys still in the ignition, purse gone. For years, locals had whispered about what might have happened to her. Some thought she'd run off to Wichita with a boyfriend. Others believed something far darker. But with no witnesses and no body, the case had gone cold by 1993. Now, nearly 2 decades later, her story had surfaced again, literally from beneath the Kansas soil. Detectives reached out to Laura's surviving relatives, including her younger brother, David Bennett, who was only 15 when she disappeared. When he got the call, he broke down before the officer could even finish his sentence. "I always knew," he told reporters quietly days later, his voice cracking. "I knew she didn't just leave. Laura wouldn't do that." Back in 1991, Laura had been known as one of those people who seemed to brighten up every space she walked into. She worked mornings at the diner and evenings at a local bar part-time to save for nursing school. Friends remembered her smile and her plans to move to Kansas City the following year. "She was just full of life," said her co-worker, Mary Lou Jenkins. She talked about getting out, but she loved this town too. That summer had been unusually hot, and Haviland was in the middle of a long drought. On June 12th, Laura finished her late shift, clocked out around 11:15 p.m., and was seen chatting briefly with a customer outside, a man driving a green pickup truck. According to the few witnesses around that night, she waved goodbye and started walking toward her car. No one ever saw her again. For weeks, search parties combed through fields, creeks, and farm roads. Flyers went up on telephone poles, and local volunteers took turns canvassing nearby counties. Police interviewed dozens of people, including co-workers and friends, but the investigation soon hit a wall. With no physical evidence and no solid suspects, the case slowly faded from headlines. By the end of 1991, Laura's name had become another cold file in the sheriff's office cabinet. But detectives never fully forgot her. One of them, retired Deputy Hank Lawson, said later that Laura's case always stayed with him. "There was something about that girl," he told a local paper in 2012. "You don't just disappear off Main Street in Haviland. Somebody had to know something." In 2008, when the remains were found, Lawson, now long retired, came out of retirement to assist as a volunteer consultant. DNA samples were collected from the bones, and forensic teams used advances in mitochondrial DNA testing to compare them with samples from David Bennett. Weeks later, the results confirmed what they'd already suspected. The remains belonged to Laura. After 17 long years, she had finally been found. The official announcement came on a grey November morning. Reporters crowded into the small county courthouse, where Sheriff Tom Hanley gave a brief but emotional statement. "Today we can finally say that Laura Bennett is no longer missing," he said, pausing as his voice faltered. "We will not rest until the person responsible for her death is brought to justice. The question was, Who could have done it? In 1991, there had been rumors of a drifter passing through town, a man who'd been seen at the diner several times in the weeks before Laura's disappearance. He'd sat at the counter, quiet but watchful, always asking for coffee refills and never paying with cash. Witnesses remembered his truck, a faded green Ford, the same color as the one Laura was last seen speaking beside. But back then, without a name or license plate, investigators couldn't track him down. He'd vanished just as quickly as Laura had. Now, with the discovery of her remains, detectives revisited every piece of evidence. They combed through old logs, notes, and interview tapes stored on aging VHS reels. Most of the evidence had deteriorated, but one item survived, a scrap of denim fabric found in her car, thought to be part of a man's work jacket. Back in 1991, DNA technology was primitive, and testing it wasn't possible. But in 2008, forensic science had evolved. Samples were sent to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation's forensic lab in Topeka for analysis. Technicians used advanced DNA profiling to extract a partial genetic profile from the fabric. It wasn't much, just a partial male profile, but it was enough to be uploaded into the National CODIS database. Weeks turned into months. Then, almost a year later, a hit came back. It matched to a man named Frank Delaney, the 54-year-old truck mechanic from Wichita, who'd been arrested in the early 2000s for aggravated assault, but had served only a short sentence. When investigators pulled his old records, they froze. Frank Delaney had once lived in Haviland for less than 6 months in 1991, working odd jobs and frequenting the Lone Star Diner. His truck at the time, a green 1979 Ford pickup. Detectives drove to Wichita and quietly began building a profile on Delaney. He lived alone in a small rented house on the edge of town, worked nights and kept mostly to himself. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, but a little strange. He was known to collect old tools and scrap parts, and he'd occasionally go on long drives out of town for no apparent reason. When detectives began tailing him, he didn't seem to notice. He still drove an old truck, though not the same one from the 90s. They brought him in for questioning in August 2009 under the pretense of a follow-up on an unrelated case. For nearly 2 hours, Delaney maintained calm, even friendly composure, until detectives mentioned Laura Bennett's name. His eyes flickered and his tone shifted. "That was a long time ago," he said flatly. "People move on." When asked where he was the night of June 12, 1991, he shrugged. "I don't remember," he said, "but I know I didn't hurt anyone." Investigators left that interview convinced they were finally on the right path. They obtained a warrant for his DNA and compared it to the partial sample from the denim fabric. Within weeks, the results confirmed what they had been waiting to see. The DNA matched. On September 28, 2009, police surrounded Frank Delaney's home just before dawn. Neighbors watched as officers led the older man, now gray-haired and unshaven, out in handcuffs. He offered no resistance. When asked by a reporter if he had anything to say, he replied softly, "You can't bury the past forever." The arrest sent shockwaves through Haviland. People who'd lived through the early 90s couldn't believe it. The quiet man they'd once seen drinking coffee at the diner was now accused of murdering Laura Bennett. For the Bennett family, the news brought a mix of relief and anguish. David, now in his 30s, stood outside the courthouse the next day, tears in his eyes. "We've waited so long for this," he said. "I just hope we finally get answers about why." But those answers wouldn't come easily. As the case moved toward trial, new details began to emerge, some that would paint a disturbing picture of what might have really happened that night. The first pre-trial hearing for Frank Delaney took place in late 2009, and from the very start, it drew more attention than any case Haviland had seen in years. Local reporters filled the courtroom benches, while curious townspeople waited outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man accused of killing Laura Bennett nearly 2 decades earlier. He appeared quiet and detached, his face lined with age, hands clasped in front of him as the judge read the charges: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and unlawful disposal of human remains. Delaney said little, only muttering a soft "not guilty" as his attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. For prosecutors, the case was far from simple. There was no direct eyewitness, no confession, and most of the physical evidence had degraded over time. What they had was circumstantial. The DNA match on the denim fabric, witness memories from 1991, and Delaney's presence in town during the time of Laura's disappearance. But to the prosecution, it was enough. Science doesn't forget, District Attorney Carla Newton told reporters. Even when people do, the truth remains in the evidence. As the trial began in early 2010, jurors were taken back to the summer of 1991. Prosecutors painted a vivid picture of a young woman full of dreams, crossing paths with a man who harbored darker intentions. They showed photographs of Laura's recovered remains, the bracelet engraved with her initials, and a map marking where her body was found, just 6 miles from where Delaney's rented trailer had stood that same year. The state's key forensic expert explained how modern DNA analysis could recover partial genetic profiles from degraded materials once thought unusable. He testified that the odds of the fabric belonging to someone other than Delaney were 1 in 23 million. When the jury heard that, a hush fell across the courtroom. David Bennett sat in the front row, gripping his wife's hand tightly. Behind him, several of Laura's old friends and co-workers sat weeping quietly. The defense, however, tried to cast doubt. They argued that the evidence was too old, and that contamination could have occurred during years of storage. Delaney's attorney suggested that the DNA might have been transferred innocently, as Delaney was a frequent diner customer. "There is no proof that my client ever harmed Laura Bennett," the defense insisted. "All we have are coincidences from a time long gone." But prosecutors countered with something new, a witness who had recently come forward. A retired farmer named Carl Dorsey, now in his 70s, testified that he remembered seeing a green pickup truck parked near the county line the same week Laura disappeared. "I didn't think much of it back then," he said, "but when I saw his face on the news, it hit me. That was his truck." Dorsey's statement placed Delaney near the scene where Laura's remains were found. Another chilling piece of evidence surfaced during testimony. An old photograph discovered in Delaney's former storage unit, showing Laura at the diner counter. It had been taken without her knowledge. The photo was dated May 1991, just weeks before she vanished. Prosecutors argued that the picture suggested Delaney had been watching her for some time. In court, when that photograph was shown, Delaney lowered his head, refusing to look. For many in the room, that moment felt like silent confirmation. As the trial went on, details emerged that revealed a darker side to Frank Delaney's past. Witnesses from Wichita testified that he had a history of aggressive behavior toward women, though none had filed official complaints. One former co-worker described him as quiet, but always staring too long, like he was studying you. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On the afternoon of June 14, 2010, exactly 19 years to the day after Laura Bennett went missing, they returned with a verdict. Guilty on all counts. When the judge read the decision aloud, David Bennett closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Across the aisle, Delaney sat motionless, showing no emotion as deputies approached to escort him out. Before being led away, he turned briefly toward the Bennett family and said in a low voice, "You think you know the truth?" Those would be the last words he ever spoke publicly. Delaney was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge described his crime as a cruel act that robbed a young woman of her future and a family of their peace. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around David, who looked both relieved and hollow. "Justice doesn't bring her back," he said softly. "But maybe it lets her rest now." For the people of Haviland, the verdict brought closure to a chapter that had lingered like a shadow for almost 2 decades. Old-timers who'd once believed Laura had simply run off now felt the sting of regret. The Lone Star Diner closed years earlier, but locals often said her memory still lingered there, in the empty booth by the window where she'd served coffee night after night. In 2012, a memorial plaque was placed in her honor near the courthouse lawn. It read simply, "In memory of Laura Bennett, gone but never forgotten." The dedication drew dozens of townspeople, some who hadn't seen each other in years. They shared stories, laughed softly, and cried together. One of Laura's old co-workers said she'd be surprised to see this many folks show up for her, but she deserved it. The years that followed brought even more reflection. The case inspired new attention to cold cases across Kansas, prompting the creation of a regional task force that used updated DNA, technology to revisit dozens of unsolved disappearances from the 1980s and 1990s. Several of those later resulted in arrests. Detectives credited Laura Bennett's case as the spark that changed how they handled long-forgotten files. In 2015, retired Deputy Hank Lawson, who had helped identify Laura's remains, received a state commendation for his dedication. During his acceptance speech, he looked out at the audience and said quietly, "Every case deserves one more look." Because time doesn't erase the truth, it just buries it deeper. Even in prison, Frank Delaney maintained his innocence, refusing all interviews. But in 2022, a cellmate later told investigators that Delaney had occasionally talked about a girl from Haviland and that he never meant to kill her. The statement came too late for any closure. But it confirmed what everyone had already suspected. Laura had trusted the wrong man that night, and he'd made sure her story stayed buried. Today, Haviland remains a quiet farming town, its streets lined with the same old brick buildings and family. Stores that stood in the early 90s, the wind still moves through the fields the same way it did that October afternoon in 2008 when her body was found. Locals say that on calm evenings, when the air is still and the sun sets behind the grain silos, you can almost hear the distant sound of a waitress laughing inside the diner that's no longer there. For David Bennett, now a father of two, the past still echoes in small ways. Every June he drives out to the spot where his sister's memorial sits beneath a tree near the old county road. He leaves a single white flower and says a few words before heading home. "She didn't get her future," he once told a local reporter, "but she gave this town its conscience back." Laura Bennett's case stands as a reminder of the power of persistence, of technology, and of love that refuses to fade with time. For nearly 20 years, her story was one of unanswered questions. But when the truth finally surfaced from that Kansas soil, it didn't just expose a killer. It reminded an entire town that justice, no matter how long delayed, still matters. And in the end, beneath the vast, endless sky of western Kansas, that truth will always whisper through the fields that once hid her, silent, patient, but never